Winter of 1873 did not arrive in the Peace River country the way winters usually did. Gradual, forgiving, giving a body time to lay in stores and patch the roof and say proper goodbyes to the warmth. That year it came overnight, like a verdict, like something that had already been decided long before anyone thought to ask. Clementine Ashford was 22 years old, and she had 4 days of cornmeal left in the barrel, a daughter not yet 3 who coughed in her sleep, and a debt notice from Edmund Hale that she kept folded so small it fit inside her coat pocket, as if keeping it close might help her understand it better. It never did. The figure on the paper was $160. The figure in her tin box behind the loose hearth stody was $4.30. She had done the mathematics so many times the numbers had stopped feeling real. Her husband, Thomas, had been dead since August. A logging accident up the north, cut, a chain slipped, they told her, and she had always hated that word. Slipped. As if it were clumsy. As if it were no one's fault. The men who brought him home on the wagon bed wouldn't meet her eyes, and she had noticed that, and she had filed it away in the place where she kept things she wasn't yet ready to open. She had stayed because Thomas had believed in the land, because the farm at the base of the Birchwood Ridge sat on the richest soil in 40 miles, and the creek running through the eastern field never froze entirely, even in February. She had stayed because leaving felt like burying him twice. On the morning of the 21st of November, the cold on the inside of the cabin window was thick as butter. Little May was still sleeping, tucked so deeply into the quilts that only the dark curls on her head were visible. Clementine dressed in the gray light, pulling on Thomas's old work coat over her wool dress, the sleeves rolled back 4 times to reach her wrists. She wrapped her scarf twice around and went out to split kindling before May woke. The axe was frozen to the chopping block. It took 3 minutes of prying to free it. She noted this the way she noted everything now, not with panic, but with the flat, steady accounting of a woman who could not afford the luxury of panic. She had been at it 20 minutes, working through the cold until the cold itself became familiar when she heard the sound. Not the trees settling, not the creek, something lower and wrong. She found him and the ravine behind the woodpile, half covered by a fallen pine branch, as if he'd crawled beneath it deliberately. He was a large man, wide through the shoulders, dressed in trapper's gear, oilskin and heavy wool and leather, the color of dark bark. There was blood on the snow beneath him, not a little, a great deal. Clementine stood very still for a moment. The frontier was not a kind place, and a strange, bleeding man in a woman's woodyard was the sort of thing her mother back in Ontario had warned her about in letters. She thought of May, asleep inside. She thought of the axe in her hand. Then the man made a sound, low and broken, barely a sound at all, and she crossed the distance between them without deciding to. She rolled him onto his back with the axe handle as leverage. He was heavy as a felled steer. His face, when she could see it, was weathered dark by years of outdoor living, the kind of face that had forgotten what shelter felt like. There was a gash along his left side, deep and ugly, and a second wound at his shoulder that had bled through every layer he was wearing. He had not been in an accident. These were knife wounds, made with intent. His eyes opened. They were a dull, feverish gray-green, and they focused on her with the particular wildness of a man who isn't certain what's real. "The land office," he said, his voice barely above the sound of the wind. "Don't let Hale." "The deed." His head fell back. Clementine felt the name like a stone dropped into still water. Hale. Edmund Hale, who had been riding out to her farm every 3rd week since Thomas died, each time with softer words and a harder offer. Hale, who held the note on her land and seemed in no particular hurry to collect it. As long as she was considering his proposal to purchase the property and relocate the 2 of them, herself and May, back east where they'd be more comfortable. More comfortable. More comfortable. As if comfort were what the land was for. She made her decision the way she made most decisions that winter, fast, without ceremony, because there was no time for anything else. It took her the better part of an hour to get him inside. She dragged him on the piece of old canvas she used for covering the woodpile, across 40 yards of frozen ground, up the 2 porch steps that had been loose since September, and through the door sideways because he was too broad to fit straight. May woke during the last stretch and stood in the middle of the cabin floor in her nightdress, clutching the small wooden rabbit Thomas had carved for her, watching with enormous dark eyes. "Is the man sleeping?" May asked. "Almost," Clementine said. "Don't touch the fire." She got him onto the floor near the hearth. She built the fire higher than she'd allowed herself in weeks, because the alternative was watching him die of cold on top of everything else, and she could not bring herself to have done all this for nothing. She cut his outer layers away with her sewing scissors, good scissors, the ones her mother had sent in the last parcel, and looked at what was underneath. The shoulder wound was deep, but had mostly stopped bleeding. The side wound was the problem. It was long, and something had pulled at it. His crawling through the ravine, most likely. And it had opened again and was seeping steadily. She had no doctor within 12 miles. She had whiskey, a sewing kit, and the knowledge passed down from her grandmother who had crossed the Shield country decades before any railroad followed. She sent May to sit on the bed and stay there. Then she did what needed doing. The man came half-conscious twice during it. The first time he tried to rise, she put her hand flat on his chest and said, calmly and without raising her voice, that if he moved again she would use the whiskey on the outside of him instead of the inside, and that was where it would stay. He looked at her for a long moment with those unfocused gray-green eyes, and then he went still. The second time, when the needle went into the deepest part of the gash, he made a sound she felt in her back teeth, and May, from the bed, began to cry softly. Clementine talked to May the entire time she finished the stitching, about the rabbit, about what they would have for supper, about whether the name for the rabbit should be Harold or something else, and her voice never wavered once. By early afternoon she had done everything she could. The man was alive. His color was still wrong, but his breathing had steadied into something less desperate. She covered him with the second quilt and went to make cornmeal porridge for May. And then she sat down on the floor with her back against the wall and let herself shake for exactly 5 minutes before she stopped. His name was in the leather dispatch case, strapped across his chest, which she opened only because she needed to know who to notify if he didn't make it through the night. Elias Croft. She turned the name over. There were papers in the case, official ones, bearing the seal of the Dominion Lands Office in Edmonton. Elias Croft was a land surveyor, contracted by the federal government to verify property boundaries and water access rights along the Peace River settlements. She read further, because she was not a woman who stopped at the edge of a thing when the thing concerned her own survival. According to his field notes, Edmund Hale had been submitting false boundary claims to the land office for 3 years. He had been reporting the creek on our eastern field as seasonal, dry in summer, when in fact it ran year-round, fed by an underground source that made it the most reliable water access in the district. By misrepresenting the creek, Hale had ensured her land was assessed far below its actual value. He had been buying up properties this way for years, paying widows and struggling settlers fractions of what their land was worth, then correcting the survey records once the deeds were signed. And Elias Croft had found it all, had documented it, had been on his way to file it. Clementine sat with the papers in her lap for a long time. Outside, the wind worked itself up into a proper howl. May had fallen asleep across the foot of the bed. The fire popped and the man on the floor breathed in slow, even pulls. She put the papers back exactly as she'd found them, buckled the case, and set it beside him. The fever came on at nightfall, the way fevers do, not gradually, but all at once, as if his body had only been waiting for permission. He was burning by the time May was asleep. Clementine sat beside him on the hearthrug and bathed his face with the cold cloth, listening to the fragments that came out of him in the delirium. Names she didn't recognize. A river crossing, repeated several times with great urgency, and then, more than once, in a tone that was less frightened than furious, Hale's been filing false surveys since '70. The whole district. All of it. She changed the cloth and said nothing back. There was no point talking to a fever. She did not sleep. Sometime after midnight he quieted, and she sat watching the fire burn down and thinking about Thomas, and the logging accident, and the men who wouldn't meet her eyes. The chain that slipped. Hale had been making offers on their land since the first season they'd broken ground. Thomas had refused everyone, cheerfully, absolutely, the way he refused most things that were wrong. He had been healthy in July. He had been dead in August. Clementine had put the sequence away in the place where she kept things she wasn't ready to open. She opened it now, sitting on the hearthrug in the dark, and looked at it straight. On the second day, the fever broke. He woke properly in the late morning, with his hand moving toward the dispatch case, before his eyes were all the way open. She was across the room stirring porridge, and she said without turning around that the case was beside him on his right, undisturbed. He was quiet for a moment. "You read it," he said. His voice was raw. "Yes," she said. Another silence. May was at the table with a length of yarn, winding it around her fingers in the complicated way that absorbed her for 20 minutes at a stretch, if you let her. "I wasn't prying," Clementine said, still not turning around. "I needed to know if whoever did that to you was going to follow you here." "That's fair," Elias Croft said. She turned around then and got her first real look at him in daylight. He was older than she thought, perhaps 40, perhaps a few years past. The kind of age that comes from how a man's lived rather than how long. There was a deep scar running from his left ear toward his jaw, old and well-healed. His eyes in the clear winter light from the window were the gray-green of river water in November. "Edmund Hale hired men to stop you from reaching Edmonton," she said. "It was not a question. 2 of them caught me at the ford, 3 miles south of here. I got away, but not clean." He tried to push himself upright and stopped, breathing carefully. "I have to get to the land office if I don't file those documents before the quarter session." "You can't ride in that condition." "Mrs. Ashford," she said. "Clementine Ashford. And I'm not arguing about your condition, Mr. Croft. I'm telling you what's true. You have a wound in your side that I put 11 stitches into, and if you tear them open in a snowstorm 20 miles from the nearest settlement, the papers in that case will end up at the bottom of a creek." She brought him a bowl of porridge and set it on the floor beside him. "You'll go when you can ride without killing yourself. That's when you'll go." He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up the spoon. He was, as it turned out, not a man who took up much room in the ways that mattered. He didn't talk unless he had something to say. He didn't complain about the thin rations or the hard floor or the cold that came in under the door in the night. On the third day he was sitting up, and on the fourth he moved himself to the chair by the window, where he spent the daylight hours working on the field notes he hadn't finished, his handwriting small and careful in the leather-bound book. May decided on day 3 that she was not afraid of him. She decided this, the way she decided most things, by simply acting as if it were already true. She carried her wooden rabbit over to the chair by the window and held it up. "This is Harold," she said. Elias looked up from his notebook. He looked at the rabbit with the expression of a man who has not spent much time around small children and is trying very hard to respond correctly. "That's a fine rabbit," he said at last. "Papa made him," May said. "He isn't here anymore." "I know," Elias said quietly. "I'm sorry about that." May considered this. Then she climbed up onto the footstool beside the chair and settled in, Harold in her lap, apparently intending to stay. Elias looked at her for a moment, then looked at Clementine across the room, with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. He went back to his notebook. May watched him write. Clementine went back to the mending, and for a while there was no sound in the cabin but the fire and the wind and the scratch of Elias's pen. That evening Clementine came in from the barn to find that he had, somehow, moved the loose porch step, the one that had been sinking for months, and refixed it to the frame with the spare nails from the tin on the shelf. He was back in the chair, pale from the effort, pretending he hadn't just done what he'd clearly just done. "You shouldn't have done that," she said. "The step was going to go through entirely before spring," he said. "You have 11 stitches in your side. There were only 3 nails involved." She looked at him. He looked at his notebook. She went to make supper. It was on the 6th night after May was asleep that she told him about Thomas. Not all of it, not the part she'd been thinking about, the sequence of things, but the fact of him, and the farm, and what it had meant to both of them. She talked, because the silence had weight in it that needed somewhere to go, and because he was the first person who had sat in this cabin since August without wanting something from her. Elias listened without filling the spaces between her words. When she stopped talking, he didn't say he was sorry for her loss, the way everyone said reflexively, as if loss were a single thing of a single size. He said he was right about the land. The water access makes this the most viable parcel in the district. He knew what he had. Yes, Clementine said. He did. Elias was looking at the fire. Hale made him offers. Every season since we filed. Thomas refused. Every time. She paused, cheerfully. Something crossed Elias's face that she didn't have a name for. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, carefully, "What do you know about how the accident happened?" The fire cracked. Outside, the wind had dropped, and the silence it left behind was absolute. "I know what they told me," she said. "And I know what I noticed. And I've been deciding what to do with the difference." Elias looked at her then, directly, for a long count. "How long have you known?" "Since about the third night you were here," she said. "I've had a lot of quiet time to think." He was quiet for a while. "Then, it'll be in the full account if you want it to be. What I have on Hale goes back 3 years. There may be grounds for a criminal investigation, beyond the land fraud. The Mounties have jurisdiction." Clementine looked down at her hands. Thomas's wedding ring was on the chain around her neck. She'd moved it there in October because her hands had gotten too thin. She pressed it between her fingers. "I want it to be," she said. "All of it." On the 9th morning, the sky cleared. It was the dangerous beauty of the northern winter. Brilliant, still, and cold enough to freeze the inside of your nose in 2 breaths. Clear skies meant clear trails. Clementine stood at the window after breakfast and said nothing about it, but Elias was already looking. "They'll come," he said. "Probably today," she agreed. He was right. Before noon, she saw them on the ridge trail, 3 riders, moving with the particular unhurried confidence of men who are certain of their outcome. She recognized Edmund Hale's gray gelding at the front. Beside him rode a man named Brecken, who worked at the mill and had been following Hale around the district for 2 years, like a problem looking for a place to happen. The third she didn't know. Big, dark-coated, the kind of man you hire for a specific purpose. She got May into the root cellar, under the kitchen floor, with Harold and a candle, and very clear instructions. May, to her everlasting credit, did not argue. Elias had taken his position at the side window, his rifle borrowed from the rack by the door, Thomas's rifle, which Clementine had loaded herself that morning, without being asked. She took the long-barreled shotgun from behind the wood box, which had been there since Thomas brought it home the 2nd year, and had not been fired since, and checked it over. "You've used that before," Elias said, watching her. "My father had a farm in Ontario," she said. "The gun came first. The farm came second." Hale rode into the yard with his hands visible, and his voice oiled with false goodwill, which was the only way she'd ever seen him do anything. "Clementine," he called out, as if he'd ridden 20 miles just to check on her welfare. "I heard you had some trouble out here. Thought I'd see if you needed anything." He surveyed the yard with the proprietary air of a man who already considers a thing his. "It looks like someone's been in your woodyard." Clementine opened the door and stepped onto the porch. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I told you in October that you were not welcome on this property unless you came with a representative of the court. Do you have one?" Hale's pleasantness thinned slightly. "Now, there's no need for that kind of talk. I know you're in difficulty, Clementine. I know Thomas left you in a complicated position. I'm only trying to help. You're trying to take land you assessed at 1/3 of its worth by filing false water surveys with the Dominion office," Clementine said clearly, across the cold air of the yard. "We both know that's what you're trying to do." The pleasantness left Hale's face like water off a tin roof. He turned to look at the man on his left, the one she didn't know, and something passed between them that didn't need words. Brecken, beside him, had already put his hand to his belt. "The surveyor," Hale said flatly. "Where is he?" "He filed his report from the Birchwood settlement 3 days ago," Clementine said, "by relay rider. The land office in Edmonton received it yesterday morning." This was not entirely true, but Hale didn't know that, and the pause it caused, the small involuntary stillness in his posture, told her everything about how close Elias had been to the mark. Then Brecken moved, and things stopped being about words. It was quick and loud and nothing like the stories that got told about such moments afterward. Brecken came off his horse fast, and Clementine shot high and wide, deliberately, not to wound, but to break the yard's stillness and send Hale's gelding sideways in a panic. She was reloading before the echo finished. Elias had come through the door and was beside her on the porch, his rifle up, and something in the way he moved. The absolute calm of it. The unhurried certainty changed the arithmetic of the situation visibly. The man Clementine didn't know took one look at Elias and stopped. "Stop," Elias said, simply, "the way you tell a dog to sit." They stopped. Brecken had one hand raised, the other pressed to his ear, where a wood splinter from the porch post had cut him, his face white with something that had moved past anger and to something less comfortable. The unknown man's hands were very, very still. Hale was still on his horse, which had come back around in a half-circle. His face had the particular gray color of a man who has just watched a plan he considered complete become something else entirely. "Those documents have already been filed," he said. His voice was doing something it had never done in Clementine's presence before. It was unsteady. "Even if that's true, it doesn't prove anything. It's one surveyor's notes." "It's 3 years of surveyor's notes," Elias said, "cross-referenced with the original Dominion records and signed by 2 corroborating witnesses at the settlement. It proves the boundary filings. It proves the boundary filings. It proves the water misrepresentation. And the affidavit attached to it." He paused. "Concerns the logging accident at the North Cut in August." The temperature in the yard seemed to drop another 5 degrees. Hale looked at Clementine, and she saw it then, not remorse, nothing so clean as that. Just the recognition in his eyes that she had known, and that he had underestimated exactly what a woman with nothing left to lose was capable of sitting quietly and deciding. "Thomas wouldn't sign," Hale said. The words came out differently than she expected, not defiant, just flat, almost bewildered, as if he still didn't entirely understand it. "I offered him twice what the property was worth by my numbers. He wouldn't sign. He said the land wasn't his to sell, it was May's. Who says that? Who turns down that kind of money over a principle?" "A good man," Clementine said. She said it without heat. The anger was there. It had been there since August, banked and steady as the hearthstone coal. But she didn't need to spend it on Edmund Hale. There was a better use for it. "Get off my land," she said. "Don't come back. The Mounties will be here before the week's out, and you can tell them everything you just told me. It'll go better for you than if they hear it from someone else." Hale looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and rode, and Brecken and the other man followed, because there was nothing left for them there. The yard went quiet. The birch trees along the fence stood perfectly still in the cold air. Beside her, Elias let out a slow breath. He was gripping the porch post with his left hand, the one not holding the rifle, and she could tell by the careful shallowness of his breathing that the past 20 minutes had cost him something. "You should sit down," she said. "In a minute," he said. She let him have his minute. The Northwest Mounted Police arrived 4 days later from the Fort Vermilion detachment, 2 officers, brisk and thorough, who spent the better part of a morning with Elias's documents and another hour with Clementine's account of what Hale had said in the yard. They were, she noted, considerably more interested in the account of Thomas's death than she had expected them to be. One of them wrote for a very long time. Edmund Hale was taken into custody in Peace River Crossing on a Thursday. Brecken went the same afternoon. The charges included fraud against the Crown, land misrepresentation, and, after the investigation Elias had been quietly building for months was laid out in full, conspiracy in the death of Thomas Ashford. The Dominion Land Office sent a commissioner in early December, a precise and overworked man named Forsyth, who reviewed the corrected survey records and confirmed that the Ashford property had been deliberately misassessed. He looked at the creek running through the eastern field, which had not frozen despite 3 weeks of hard cold, and wrote in his ledger for a considerable time. The corrected assessment came to more than 4 times the original. Clementine had a moment, standing in her kitchen after Forsyth left, where she sat down because her legs stopped working and held the paper in both hands, and was very still for a long time. The snow came in force through December, and the trails closed, and Elias Croft remained at the Ashford farm because there was nowhere sensible to go. He mended the north fence where the elk had broken through in November. He re-chucked the chimney mortar that had been crumbling since September. He was not a farmer by trade, he said so plainly, but he was a man who could look at a broken thing and reason out how it connected to the next broken thing, which turned out to be most of what farming required. May had decided somewhere in the second week that Elias was a permanent feature of the landscape, in the way that small children occasionally make decisions about the arrangement of things and simply wait for the adults to catch up. She had given Harold an official role as overseer of the windowsill. She had shown Elias, in painstaking detail, how Thomas used to make shadow animals on the wall with the lantern light, and had watched with great patience while Elias produced something that was probably a rabbit and possibly a bear, and had told him it was very good, which was generous. One evening, late, with May long asleep and the fire burned down to coals, Elias said, "The Northern Survey starts again in March. I'll be heading up toward the headwaters." "I know," Clementine said. She was mending, as she often was. The lamp threw a steady orange circle across the table. Outside, the Peace River country lay under 2 feet of snow, quiet as a held breath. "You'll be all right," he said. It was half statement and half something else. "I've been all right," she said. "Since August. I've been all right by necessity." She set the mending down and looked at him across the table. "That's different from being all right because you want to be." Elias was quiet for a long moment. The fire settled, a log shifted. "The Northern Survey," he said, "takes about 4 months, if the spring thaw cooperates." "And then?" He turned his hat in his hands, a habit she'd come to recognize, something he did when he was making his way carefully toward something. "The Dominion office talks about setting a permanent survey station in the district, somewhere with reliable water access." A pause. "I wouldn't be opposed to that." Clementine looked at him steadily. "Is that your way of saying you'd come back?" "It's my way of saying," he said slowly, "that the northern valleys will still be there in September, and some things are easier to map on a second pass when you know the terrain." She picked up the mending again, but she was almost smiling, and she didn't bother hiding it. "The step you fixed in November," she said. "The second one from the top needs looking at too." "I noticed," he said. "It'll keep till September," she said. "It will," he agreed. The fire cracked once, bright and clean, and the Peace River winter held the cabin close, and outside, under all that pressing, darking cold, the creek in the eastern field ran on, steady and quiet and uninterrupted, the way it always had, through everything, carrying what it carried toward wherever it was going. I keep thinking about what Clementine did in that first moment. Not the dragging, not the stitching, not the shotgun on the porch. I keep thinking about the 5 minutes she let herself shake, and then stopped. There's something in that I've been trying to put words to for a while. We talk a lot about strength like it's the absence of fear, or the absence of exhaustion, or the absence of grief. But Clementine was afraid. She was exhausted in the bone-deep way that comes from months of surviving something you didn't choose. She was grieving a husband she hadn't finished grieving yet, and underneath that grief was something harder. The slowly forming suspicion that his death wasn't an accident at all. She carried all of that, and she still crossed the yard. That's not the absence of fear. That's something else. That's a decision made in spite of everything telling you not to. I think about Elias too, and what it means that he handed over information that could have gotten him killed to a woman he'd never met in a farmhouse in the middle of a Peace River winter. He trusted her competence before he had any real reason to. And she earned it. Not by being fearless, but by being clear-eyed. She read those documents and she understood exactly what they meant, not just for herself, but for every family Hale had quietly dispossessed over 3 years of false surveys. Her mind was sharp, because she'd kept it sharp, even when everything around her was trying to narrow her world down to just survival. That combination, the kind of person who acts rightly even when it costs them, and who also thinks carefully enough to act effectively, is rarer than either quality alone. Clementine had both, and I don't think that was luck. I think it was the result of years of small choices that nobody saw, choices made in empty rooms with no one watching. And May, I keep coming back to May, 3 years old with her wooden rabbit, telling the large frightening stranger that her papa made it and he isn't here anymore. There's a kind of honesty in children that adults spend a lot of effort learning back. May didn't have defenses yet. She just walked across the room and held up the thing she loved most and said, "Here, this is what matters to me." And that small act, that complete openness, was part of what thawed the whole situation, wasn't it? It was part of what made Elias stay and fix the porch step, part of what made the cabin feel, for the first time in months, like something worth protecting rather than something slowly failing. What happened to Clementine wasn't random. Hale's scheme collapsed because she had been honest when she didn't have to be, careful when she was exhausted, and willing to act when acting was dangerous. Those three things together are what shifted the outcome. Not luck, not rescue cause and effect playing out over months of ordinary days. I think that's what stays with me most. The big moments, the confrontation in the yard, the Mounties arriving, the land assessment that changed everything, those didn't come from nowhere. They came from every quiet, unwitnessed choice Clementine made in the months before. The way a person conducts themselves when no one is watching is exactly the thing that determines what's possible when it matters. The creek ran through that eastern field all along. It just needed someone honest enough to say so.